Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to fix a pesky tiling problem on our landscape materials. And if you're painting your landscape with materials and you zoom out just a little bit, you're going to see this tiling problem. It's a repeating texture. It doesn't look great, and we'd like it to look a little bit more natural. If you zoom in and look really close, it looks great. But as soon as you look at the horizon, you'll start to see some repeating patterns, and this doesn't look natural at all. So first, we're going to set up a landscape and add materials and create a landscape material so that we can paint onto our landscape. But if you already have a landscape with materials, you can go ahead and skip ahead to the part where we begin fixing this tiling problem. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is make a brand new project. I'm going to go ahead and launch Unreal Engine 5.4.1. That's the latest version at the time of recording this. And I'm going to go to Games and choose a blank project. We're going to start from scratch. It's going to be just a blueprint project. I'll choose my folder, and I'm just going to call this project Fix Tiling and create. Okay, so we have our brand new project, and I'd just like to start with a fresh map. So I'm first going to make a new folder in Content called Maps, and I'm going to make a new level, starting with Basic. Go ahead and create that. You can choose Open World if you like, doesn't matter. And I'm going to save this level. In New Maps, I'm going to call it Tiling Fix. Doesn't matter what we call the map. And I don't need the floor because I'm going to have a landscape. So I'm going to delete the floor, and I'm going to go to landscape mode and just add a fresh landscape. I don't really want to mess with any settings here. I'm just going to click create and get my new landscape here. And just to give it a few hills and ridges, I'm going to do a little bit of landscape sculpting. I'm actually going to zoom way out, up my brush size all the way, and give myself some hills, a little bit of variation here in the landscape. And that way, if I go down to the ground, things are looking nice and hilly, kind of irregular. Okay, now I'm going to hit Shift 1. That's just a shortcut to go back to selection mode here. And I'm going to find my player start and just make sure that that player start is not under the ground. It probably is now. So I'm going to find it. I'm going to hit F to focus in on it and just bring it up above the ground. And that way, if we play test, I'm not trapped underneath my landscape. Okay, so we have our landscape, and I just quickly threw it together, and I want to add a material for my landscape. So with my landscape selected, I can search for material and see that it's got none set as the landscape material. I'd like to make a landscape material for this. And for that, I'm going to create a new folder in Content called Landscape. And here I'm going to make a new material. So right-click, select Material. I'm going to call this M_landscape. And I'll go ahead and assign this landscape as my landscape material. So now it looks nice and boring. Now I'd like to be able to paint layers onto my landscape. And to have layers, I'm going to need some materials, and I'm going to get some from Quixel Bridge. So I'm going to go up to the drop down here, select Quixel Bridge, and get some surfaces. So let's take a look at what surfaces we have here. We'll go to the home icon, click on surfaces, and we'll search for some surfaces. Now, surfaces like the concrete or the brick that we see here, these are not going to work so well with this technique because we're going to be blending the texture as the distance changes. And blending doesn't work so well with things like well-defined edges of bricks or rocks and things like that. But for something like this debris or a ground texture, it actually works quite nicely. So for things like dirt, it's going to work really well. We can take something like this sand or this soil here. These would be really good examples. So I'm going to go to sand and find a decent looking dirt texture. Desert Western Ground Gravel seems okay. So I'm going to full screen that, and just for this video, I'm going to choose highest quality, but please take your own system specs into account and go a little lower if you need to. I'm going to go ahead and download this one. And once it's done downloading, I'm going to add it to my project with add. So now I have this material, and if I double click on its base color texture, I see what it looks like, a sort of dirt gravelly kind of texture. I'm going to get another one just so we have more than one for this example. I'll go ahead and choose this dry sand texture here. We'll go ahead and download that, and I'll click plus to add it to my project. So we have this sand texture here. And just to have a little bit more of a variation, I'll go ahead and choose something that has some rockiness, a little bit more variation. I'll go ahead and take this dry sand as well and add that one. Okay, so we have this dry sand, and it has a little bit more variation, and we'll give this one a try as well and see how well it does with the techniques we're going to use. Okay, so I'm done with Quixel Bridge. I now have some textures that I can use in my landscape material. So I'm going to open my landscape material here, going to dock it at the top. And the first thing I'm going to do is select my result node and search for rough and check fully rough. That way we don't have any shininess, and I don't have to plug in anything for my roughness here. It's just going to be flat. And I want to blend between layers on my landscape, and to do that I can search for landscape layer blend, and this allows me to have multiple layers. So I know I downloaded 3 layers, but for simplicity I think I'm just going to use a couple of them. So I'll start with this red sand. I'm going to take this base color texture and the normal map, that's these two here. I'm going to drag them in, and my landscape layer blend needs layers. I'm going to select it and add layers to its layers array. The first one I'm going to call, we'll just call it red dirt. And I can hook up my base color RGB into layer red dirt and hook that into base color on the landscape. And I can add another layer to my landscape layer blend. I'm going to use probably this more rocky sand here for that one. So I'm going to add another layer here and call the second layer rocky sand. And I can bring in the base color and normal maps for the rocky sand. So I'll bring them in here. And the second input for my landscape layer blend is going to get the base color for rocky sand. Now I can duplicate my landscape layer blend, and I can get my normal maps here. I just need to make sure that these are correct. The red dirt has to use the normal map for that red dirt texture. So if you're not sure and you got them mixed up here, just go ahead and delete those normal maps and find the actual texture and bring that normal map in for that. There's the one for the red dirt. And of course this one, I can browse to it and find its normal map and bring that in for rocky sand. And now I have a landscape layer blend I can hook in to normal. So now I have a material using landscape layer blend, which means I can go back to my level and go into landscape mode and go into paint. I can now see down here in the layers section any layers that we add. Now I don't see any, so what I can do is reset the landscape material with the curved icon and reassign our material called M landscape. I can select it in the content drawer, and then back here on my landscape, I can click that left arrow to assign the landscape. Now I see the layers here. Now before I can paint these layers on, I'm going to need to click the plus to create a layer info asset for each one. So I'm going to first do this for red dirt, choosing weight blended layer. This allows us to blend the layers together rather than painting them on top of each other. So that's what I want. So I'm going to select weight blended layer and allow this to go into my landscape folder. I don't need to rename it. I can click on save. And now I see that my landscape is using this dirt texture. Now, depending on how close I am to the landscape, it doesn't really look too tiled, but if I start zooming out, I can really see the tiling, and that's the problem we're going to fix in this video. Now, I also need to create layer info for the rocky sand, so I'm going to click plus and choose weight blended layer, let it go into my landscape folder, click on save, and now I can paint with the rocky sand material. So I'd just like to create some variation here using the rocky sand layer. I'm going to select that layer and increase my brush size all the way so that I can paint some of this layer onto my landscape. I'll just go ahead and let half of my landscape be this rocky sand layer. Okay, and I'll increase the fall off all the way and make it a little bit more smooth of a transition between the two layers. Okay, so now if I zoom back in and come back to the ground, I can really see the tiling on these textures. It doesn't look good at all. So that's what we're going to fix. Now I'm going to go ahead and go back out into selection mode so that we can get a better view. And this rocky sand texture is really a good example of the tiling problem. And that's because we have defining characteristics. These rocks sticking out through the sand, they really repeat. And if you zoom out, you can really see that tiling. It doesn't look good at all. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is go back to our landscape material. And all we're doing is tiling the texture samples for any given layer. So we get this one texture here. We have a single image and it's tiling over and over again. So we need a way to break that up and make it look less uniform. And we're going to do this using several techniques. We're going to go in stages here. The first thing we're going to do to break up that repetitive nature of our textures is to add a color variation. So for each of these layers, we're going to take the base color texture and we're going to multiply it by a color to give ourselves a sort of tinted version of the base color. So I'm going to copy both of these texture samples. And since we're going to be using these texture samples in multiple locations on the material, I'd like to create a node that we can access so that we can see the name of the texture that we're using. So with both of these textures selected, I'm going to Control-C to copy and move up a little bit and paste them. And I'm going to take their RGB color values and create a named reroute node for each one. So if I search for named, I can get a add named reroute declaration node. If I select that, I can now create a named reroute node, which is kind of like storing this texture sample in a variable. Now this one is the red dirt. So I'm just going to call this red dirt underscore texture sample. And now I can use this red dirt texture sample anywhere I'd like to use the actual texture sample, such as right here. If I right click and search for red dirt, I can get that texture sample and use it here instead of the actual texture sample. And now I have a named node so I don't confuse these two because they do kind of look similar to each other. So I'm going to make a named reroute node for the rocky dirt as well. And because my landscape layer blend calls it rocky sand, that's what I'm going to call it. So I'm going to go ahead and make a named reroute node and call this one rocky sand underscore texture sample. Now I don't have to use the actual texture sample. I can use the named reroute node rocky sand. So we're going to do that. And there are different colors too, which kind of helps us a little bit. Now we can do the same thing with the normal maps. It's perhaps even harder to tell the difference between them just by looking at them. So I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm going to create a named reroute node for the first one called red dirt underscore normal. And we'll make one for rocky sand as well. Named reroute node. We'll call it rocky sand underscore normal. And now we can use the named reroute nodes instead of the texture samples. So we'll use red dirt normal for the first one and rocky sand normal for the second one. Now our material looks a little bit more manageable here, and we're going to keep these nice and organized. So I'm going to take both the base colors and the normals and move them over to the side and give my red dirt texture sample a comment. Red dirt texture sample. And I'll put my rocky sand right next to it with a comment, rocky sand texture sample. And we'll do the same thing for the normal maps. We have red dirt normal, and we have our rocky sand normal here, rocky sand normal. And something I like to do with my comments is select them and check show bubble when zoomed, and that way we can see what they are even when we're zoomed out. So I'm going to do that for all 4 of these. Okay, so far we have the exact same material. If we go back and take a look, nothing has changed. All we've done is created some named reroute nodes for the textures we're using, and that way we can always go back in here and change these textures to something else if we want. And everywhere we reference those named reroute nodes, we get exactly what's hooked in to the named reroute node. Now, one thing that can help a little bit with tiling is to alter the texture coordinates. If we use different values for our texture coordinates for the texture samples we're using, we can scale the textures being used, and for a very large landscape like this, that can be beneficial. For instance, if we take our texture sample and hook in a value into the UV's input, we can scale those UVs. I'll show you what I mean. If I take my red dirt texture sample and duplicate it, I can pass in texture coordinate values here by getting a texture coordinate node. And with my texture coordinate node selected, I can go to my U and V tiling and change these values. I'm going to change both to 0.5 and hook those into the UVs. And now I have different UVs for this texture. I'm going to go ahead and create a named reroute node for this one and call this red dirt underscore text chord underscore half. So I now have the same thing, but my texture coordinates are cut in half, and this is going to result in a larger texture, which is a little harder to see when it's tiled. We still have tiling, we haven't fixed that yet, but this is a little bit less noticeable at closer distances. And we'll see what it looks like when we change to text chord half, but I'm going to do the same thing for my rocky sand texture sample as well. So I'm going to copy the texture sample. I'm going to copy the texture coordinate node over here that has 0.5 for U and V tiling and hook that in. And we'll make a named reroute node for this one called rocky sand underscore text chord underscore half. So we now have half versions of each. And I'll go ahead and keep these inside of the comment for the regular texture sample named reroute nodes. That way they're all packaged together like this. So now if we go back to our material and change the base color to use these half versions of both red dirt and rocky sand, just going to search for half and get them here, we can replace these texture samples with the half versions. And before I apply it, I'm going to go and take a look at how it looks. And then I'll bring this material off screen so that I can apply it and we'll see it change. So applying now. And there we go. The texture is larger. If we zoom out, we still see that it's tiled, but it's twice as large. So we've done a little bit to mitigate it. Not a lot, but it's a little bit better. Okay, so we're going to use that text chord half, but I still want my other named reroute nodes here, the texture samples, just in case we need those. So that's the first thing we're going to do. Next, I'd like a color variation of each of these textures. That way we'll have 2 versions, the normal one plus one that's kind of tinted by an additional color. So I need to make some room as our normal maps are a little bit in the way. So I'm going to move the normal maps above our texture samples. And I'm going to use my text chord half. So I'm going to search for half and get my red dirt and search for half and get my rocky sand. And I'd like to multiply these by a color. Now I'd like to just use one channel from our texture sample. such as the red channel or the green channel. It doesn't really matter which. And to get that channel, I can drag off my named reroute and type break and choose breakout float 3 components. And then I can access, say, just the red channel, for instance. And if you're curious to see what just the red channel looks like for one of these textures, we can always plug it straight into base color and see what it looks like. So why don't we go ahead and just disconnect everything hooked into our result node and bring our result node all the way over and see what it looks like to just plug in the red channel from one of our textures into base color. If we apply that and go ahead and take a look, we'll see that now my landscape is just using that red channel from the texture. It's grayscale because it's only one of the channels in the RGB color of the texture. But what I want to do is multiply that red channel by a color. So I can hold M and left click to get a multiply, and I'm going to multiply that red by a color value. So I'm going to hold 3, left click, get a color, hook that in, and change the color. Let's say I'd like to change it to a bit of a red, or perhaps a nice dark brown, and move the saturation down a little bit. And we'll have a color. We can hook this into base color to see what that looks like. We can apply, and we basically have that red value scaled by the color we've chosen. So this is going to be a variation on the original texture. So for the red dirt, for example, we can make this a parameter that we can adjust for the color variation of this texture. So I'm going to right click and convert it to a parameter and prefix it with red dirt underscore, and I'm going to call this variation tint. And now we have this parameter we can change for the red dirt, and this gives us a color variation on the original red dirt texture sample. So I'd like a named reroute node for this color variation. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to drag off the multiply and create a new named reroute node. And this is going to be red dirt underscore base color underscore variation. So we've got a color variation on the base color. So I'm going to keep this just under my red dirt texture sample, and I'm going to give it its own comment here. So I'm going to go ahead and hit C and say red dirt base color variation. And I'll go ahead and click Show Bubble when zoomed. And now we have a color variation for the red dirt. I'd like to do the same thing here for the rocky sand. So I'm going to go ahead and take the rocky sand text chord half, drag out and break out float 3 components, and use a multiply node, multiplying the red with a new color. I'm going to hold 3, left click, hook that up. And this rocky sand can have its own color variation parameter. Just like we have red dirt variation tint, we can convert this one to a parameter and call it rocky sand underscore variation tint. And we can give this one maybe a little more yellow of a color, bring it down into the yellowish brown, and then a little bit less saturation, just so it's a little bit more subtle. But of course, this is a parameter, so we're going to adjust it a little bit later on. But now we have this color multiplied by a variation tint. We can go ahead and hook that into our material's base color and apply and see what this looks like. And there's a sort of different variation on that rocky sand texture. We can always hook in that rocky sand itself, apply it, and see that the original material base color looks like this. So we have a sort of faded out version of it as a bit of variation. So I'm going to create a named reroute for the rocky sand. We'll go ahead and do that. I'm going to call this one rocky sand underscore base color underscore variation. And this one will get its own comment, just like red dirt did. We'll call it rocky sand base color variation. So we got a comment for that. Okay, so far all we've done is create a new color variation of our original base color. How are we going to use it? Well, I'd like to blend between the original color and the new color variation according to some other texture. In other words, we can interpolate between our regular texture and our variation using some grayscale value. And a good grayscale image to use is a built-in texture that Unreal Engine just already has in engine content. First, I want a new texture sample, just like we have up here. We have a texture sample using our sand texture. We have a texture sample here using another one. I'm going to get a new texture sample. So search for texture sample. And for its texture, I'm going to change its texture property here and search for macro variation. Now, I don't see it, but if I click the gear icon and I show engine content, there will be a default macro variation. In some engine versions, it's just called macro variation. If I select that, I now have this texture, which if I browse to, I'll see its folder in engine content, and I can double click it and see that it's just this pattern here. It's kind of splotchy, and I like to use this as a way to blend between color variations in my base color textures here. So now that I have this macro variation, first I want to see what it looks like if I just hook it into base color on my material and click apply. If I go back, I'll see that now we're just using this weird macro variation. And yeah, it's really tiled. It's no less tiled than any other texture. However, if I come back and get a texture coordinate node and hook that in for my UVs and change the U and V tiling to a very, very small value, such as 0.0075, for instance. I'll do that for both U and V. If I apply that, now if I look, that texture is spread out over a larger area. And now we can use this texture to blend between our two colors, the original and the color variation. But I'd like this to be more contrasted. I'd like the light areas to be pretty much white and the dark areas to be pretty much black. And so to do that, we can take this texture sample and we can just use its red channel. And we can lerp. We can use a linear interpolate node. If we hold the L key and left click, we get a lerp, and we can take this red and hook it into the alpha. Now, wherever this alpha value being passed in is 0, then the return from the lerp is going to be whatever we have for A. And when this value is 1 for alpha, the lerp is going to return whatever we have for B. And anywhere between 0 and 1 gives us a blend, a linear interpolation between A and B. And if I make A really small, in fact, I can make it a negative value like negative 0.25, then wherever we have a dark area, it's going to be black. And if I put a very large value for B, such as, say, 2, then the white is going to be very white. And if I hook that into base color and apply, we'll see much more of a contrast. Except if we're going to use this as a mask or an alpha for some other lerp, then the values need to be clamped between 0 and 1. So I'm going to get a clamp node, and we're going to clamp between 0 and 1. And now if we hook that into base color, we'll see the same visual result, but each value on this texture has some value between 0 and 1. So if we use this value to lerp between two colors, then we'll see this pattern, only the white will be one texture and the black will be another texture. So we can use the result of these nodes to lerp between our two color variations. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take these nodes and we're going to make a named reroute for these, just so it's clear what this is. We're going to call this one color blend underscore alpha. So this will be the alpha for a lerp between two colors. The colors will be our base color, red dirt text chord half, and our other base color, which is multiplied by a variation tint. So I'm going to take this new color blend alpha. We'll move it to the side here, give it a comment, and say color blend alpha. And we're going to lerp between our red dirt text chord half and our red dirt base color variation. So we're going to get both of those. We're going to say red dirt text chord half. We'll get that one. And red dirt base color variation. We're going to lerp between these two. So hold L and left click. We'll have the original color on the A and the base color variation on the B. And the alpha is going to be this result, color blend alpha. So I'm going to get color blend alpha, hook that in. And now we have a blend using that macro variation texture here. So we can hook this into base color and apply it, and we can see what it looks like. Take a look at that. If we zoom really far in, we'll see that it's just that same red dirt texture, right? But if we look from afar, we'll see that we're blending between the two color variations, the original and the one that we're multiplying by a tint color. And we made that red dirt variation tint a parameter, which means if we make a material instance out of this material, we can very easily adjust that parameter in real time and see what it looks like when we change it. So we'll get a chance to do that once we make a material instance out of this material. But now we have this lerped color value. We can call this a color variation mix of sorts. So what I'd like to do is make a named reroute node for this one called red dirt underscore color mix. We can call it something like that, and we'll give it its own comment here, red dirt color mix. And we'll do the same thing for the rocky sand. Let's go ahead and get our rocky sand. So first we'll get rocky sand text chord half. That's the original color. We'll also get rocky sand base color variation, and we'll get a lerp node and lerp between these two using our same color blend alpha. Now, if you wanted, you could make a different one for rocky sand as well and change these parameters if you wanted to. But I'm just going to use that color blend alpha for both. So we'll go ahead and make a named reroute for this one, and we'll call this rocky sand underscore color mix. We'll give it its own comment, rocky sand color mix. And if we're curious, we can just hook that into the base color, rocky sand color mix, to see what it looks like for the rocky sand. And there we have it. We have the original and the one that's tinted. So already this is doing a little bit to break up the monotony in the tiling of the texture. A color variation is kind of distracting us from the fact that this texture is tiling. And of course, that color tint is a parameter that we can change, and we'll change that once we make a material instance for this. Okay. Now I'd like to make an additional color variation for the distance. In other words, if we look out into the distance, I'd like to see my texture fade into another color the farther away my landscape is. Now we can achieve this distance effect using pixel depth. So I'd like to use the pixel depth, in other words, how far away a given pixel is into the scene, along with some noise. So I'd like to search for a noise texture. If I right click and get myself a texture sample node, and for the texture, I can search for noise, and we have a number of noise textures in here. Now, I'm not very happy with any of the built-in noise textures, but there is a pretty nice noise texture in starter content, which we can easily add to our project. So if I bring up my content drawer and click on add, I can select add feature or content pack. I can go to content, select starter content, and add that to my project. Now that I have starter content, I have access to a better noise texture. So here in my texture sample, I'm going to search now for Perlin. And we now have a Perlin noise texture. I'm going to use that. Now, if you want to see what that looks like just on the base color, you can see by hooking it up, applying, and here's the Perlin noise. It looks kind of like clouds, and it's very tiled. But this is a nice noise texture that I'd like to use. And because it's so tiled, I'm of course going to get a texture coordinate node and change its U and V values to a smaller value, like 0.05 for both U and V, and I'll hook this into the UVs, click apply, and now we can see that the noise is spread out over a farther distance, which is what I want. So now that I have some noise, I'd like to make a more stark contrast, kind of like what we did with our macro variation over here. I'd like to lerp between a low and a high value. I'm going to do that with my Perlin noise. So I'm going to go ahead and hold L and left click and use my Perlin noise red channel as the alpha, but I'm going to blend between an A value of really low, like -2000, and a B value of really high, like +2000. And if I hook that into base color and apply, now we got a much starker contrast. Now, I don't need to clamp this between 0 and 1 because I'm going to add the value to my pixel depth. So if I right-click and search for pixel depth, I get a pixel depth node. And if I add this to the result of my lerp, I can hold A and left-click to get an add node, and I can add these together and hook this into base color. Now I can see what this looks like. We'll see that the closer we are, the more of the black splotchiness we get, and it fades out as we go farther away. So if I zoom out, everything's white, but if I get closer, that pixel depth kicks in, and we get that black splotchiness. So this gives us a way to blend out based on distance. Now, let's say that I'd like this black to reach out a little bit farther. Well, I can always manipulate the value by adding or subtracting. If I take this result and get a subtract node, I can subtract a value, say 1000, and I take this value and hook that into base color and apply. We can see a lot more black here. So the more we subtract, the more this black splotchiness reaches out further, and that's what I'd like. Now, we can get more of a blend between the black and the white if we take our value and divide. So we can get a divide node, and if we divide by, let's say, 2000, and hook this into base color and apply, now we're not so stark of a contrast anymore, and we're blending smoothly as we get farther away. And if we'd like to use this as a lerp alpha, we can clamp this value between 0 and 1. So we'll run all this through a clamp between 0 and 1, like so, and we can create a named reroute node for these. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And I can call this one distance fade. So we have this distance fade that we can use to blend between any two values based on the distance with some Perlin noise. So I'm going to add a comment, say distance fade, and we'll set this right here next to color blend alpha. These two can be used for multiple materials. So how are we going to use that distance fade in a lerp? Kind of like what we did with our color mix. We're going to lerp between our color mix and some new color. Well, let's make that new color that we'd like to designate to be used in the distance. Well, I'd like to make a new color variation, kind of like my base color variation, where I multiply by a color, except I'd like to use different texture coordinates because this is going to be used way far out in the distance. So I'm going to first get a texture coordinate node, and I'm going to set the U and V to a nice tiny value, 0.05 and 0.05. And I'm going to get my red dirt texture sample, copy that over here, and use my texture coordinate for the UVs. And I'm going to get a lerp node, and I'm going to lerp the RGB value of this with some other color. I'm going to hold 3 and get a 3-dimensional color, and we'll use this for the distance. For the red, I'm going to go into a sort of brownish color, but we'll go nice and faded up here, something like this. And of course, this can be a parameter. I'm going to right click and convert it to one and call this red dirt underscore distance color. So that'll be the B for my blend. And we'll go ahead and blend according to some alpha, but we'll make a scalar parameter for it so we can adjust that as well. So we'll make a scalar parameter called red dirt distance color amount. And we'll give it some value, say 0.3, and hook that in. But if we adjust this parameter, we'll get more or less distance color depending on the value we pass in. And we can make a named reroute node for this. And we'll call it red dirt underscore distance color variation. So really, this is just another color variation. We'll use this in a lerp node. We can lerp between our regular color mix and our distance color variation using this distance fade that we created here. And that way we'll get our new distance color variation only in the distance. Let's go ahead and comment this and say distance color variation. And of course, this is for red dirt. I'll go ahead and put red dirt in the comment. And we'll get a lerp node. Let's go ahead and use L, get a lerp. And we're going to use our regular color mix. So red dirt color mix for the A. And we'll get our new distance color variation for the B. So red dirt distance color variation for B. And we're going to lerp these using our distance fade for the alpha. So distance fade can be our alpha here. Now let's see what that looks like plugged in to our base color. We'll go ahead and apply. And now we have this nice transition into the distance. Now this color variation, the distance color variation, that's a parameter. So we can always change that distance color. In fact, if we want it to be green, for example, we'll see that we can add some green, but I don't really like green, so I'm going to go ahead and undo that change. But we can adjust this as we see fit. And of course, we'll do that in the tweaking stage. But now we have a nice fade out based on distance. So in the distance, we have a little bit more variation, and it's fading out according to that Perlin noise, which is really nice. So this result is the final base color for our red dirt. So we'll go ahead and give this one last named reroute node. We'll call it red dirt underscore final color. So we have the overall base color for our red dirt. We'll go ahead and give it a comment, red dirt final color. And we'll do the same thing for the rocky sand. So rocky sand is going to want its own distance color variation, right? I'll go ahead and remove that. We'll take a look at the red dirt distance color variation. We can copy its texture coordinate, and we need a texture sample for the rocky sand. So we'll copy one over, hook that texture coordinate into the UVs. And just like with red dirt, we'll have a new color parameter and a distance color amount that we can lerp. So let's get a color. This one can be a little more yellow than the red dirt. This will be a parameter called rocky sand distance color. And we'll lerp these two just using the RGB values. And for the alpha, we'll get a scalar parameter called rocky sand distance color amount. We'll hook those up here. And this can get a named reroute called rocky sand distance color variation. So now we have a color variation for the rocky sand. We'll comment this, rocky sand distance color variation. And just like we did with red dirt, we'll get a lerp between the two using a distance fade. So we'll use rocky sand color mix. We'll lerp that with rocky sand distance color variation. And we're going to lerp using distance fade. And we'll use a named reroute and call this rocky sand final color. We'll give this its own comment, rocky sand final color, and we'll see what it looks like here. Rocky sand final color, hooked into base color, we'll apply that. And I'm not seeing a variation, so I'm going to go back and take a look, and it looks like my rocky sand distance color amount is 0. I'll go ahead and put that to 0.3, and now we have that variation there. So I'll go ahead and change the color just a bit, and now we can see that color variation in the distance. Okay, and we'll tweak these parameters later. For now, we have our rocky sand final color, and that's looking good. Okay, so now we have something that's a lot less tiled and works a lot better with large distances. Now, as I mentioned, with materials that have defining characteristics such as bricks or rocks, it can be still a little difficult to get rid of the tiling. If you zoom way out, you can still kind of see the tiling, but it helps to have those color variations and distance color variations when you're close to the ground. It looks a lot better. Now, the only thing left is our normal maps. We need a way to vary our normals with distance as well. Well, that's not too hard. What we can do is we can get our texture coordinate node. Let's get a texture coordinate, and we can set it to a very low value for U and V. I'm going to use 0.05 for U and V. And we'll bring in our normal maps. Now, we do have the normals way up here, but I'm going to need to use that UVs node. So I'm going to copy that normal map, bring it down here, paste that, hook in the texture coordinate for the UVs, and I'm going to lerp between this normal map texture sample and a color which is set to 0 for red and green and 1 for the blue. This will just be a flat normal. I'm going to use a lerp node and blend RGB values for these. And what am I going to use? I'm going to use the distance fade. Remember, we have our distance fade here. We're going to use that as the alpha for the normals as well. So hooking in distance fade here. Now we have a normal map that fades with the distance. So what I'm actually going to do is take these normals and bring them down here. We don't actually need the ordinary texture sample. I'm going to delete that and use my red dirt normal named reroute to store this value, which changes along with my distance fade. And this red dirt normal is what I'll use for my normal map. So we'll go ahead and contain that within the comment here, and I'll do the same thing for the normal for rocky sand. So basically, I'm just going to copy all these nodes here and replace the normal map with my rocky sand normal map here. So just hooking it into UVs and into the lerp, and I'll take my rocky sand normal and store that value here. And we'll put these all in my comment like so. So now I have the normals for red dirt and rocky sand. Now let's see what this looks like hooked in for the normal map. So I'll just use final color for red dirt for the base color and red dirt normal for the normal map. I'll hit apply, and we can see that we have the normals up close, but they fade out into the distance, so this gives us some variation. And of course, the more defined rocks that we have, the more we get blending in with the colors. So that's something to be aware of, but now we have normals as well. And we can see what it looks like with rocky sand, final color, and rocky sand, normal. And here's what that texture looks like. A lot less tiled. And because these are named reroutes, we can easily blend them using our layer blend. So the final material is going to use our landscape layer blend, blending between the final color and the normal nodes that we've created. So we can remove what we were using before, and our first landscape layer blend will have our red dirt final color hooked in and our rocky sand final color, and you can do this with as many layers as you need. And for the normal, we'll hook in the normals as well. And these will go into base color and normal. We can apply that. And now our material has both layers. We can paint using landscape paint mode, like so. And we have a lot less tiling, a lot more variation. And once we add some foliage, it's going to look even better. Just keep in mind that this works better for certain types of textures and not others. You wouldn't want to use a brick texture. You don't want well-defined rocks, at least if you want to keep those rocks well-defined, because we're doing a lot of blending here to break up the monotony of those textures. But overall, this gives us a much better material to look at from a distance without seeing all those tiles. Now, we made a lot of parameters, and that's one of the biggest strengths of material instances, is we can adjust those parameters to get the behavior we want. So what I'm going to do is browse to the M landscape, right-click, and make a material instance. I'll just name it MI landscape. I'm going to save all, and we'll go ahead and go into our landscape and change the landscape material to the material instance. And now we can easily adjust parameters on the material instance. I'm going to go ahead and bring it up and undock it. And now we can change the material parameters that we've added here. So for one, we have our red dirt distance color, which if we really want to see what that looks like, we should have more red dirt, right? So I'm going to go to landscape, get my red dirt layer, increase the brush size, and just paint red dirt for a good section here. Like so. So this is all red dirt, right? And now I can change my red dirt distance color amount if I want to. We can lower that if we want less, raise it if we want more. So I'll leave it at about 0.25. We can change the red dirt distance color. I'd like it to fade a little bit into the distance. We also have our red dirt variation tint, which if we change that, we'll see that that's the splotches here that are closer to us. So we can desaturate those if we want them to be a little more subtle. And if we wanted the base color itself to be tinted, we can multiply that by a color and tint that as well. So that is how we can break up the tiling and have materials that look a lot less tiled, even as we zoom out to farther distances. And we have more parameters to play with to customize the look and feel to get it more to our liking. So I hope you like this video. It's a little bit more involved than just using a base color and a normal map. We're varying our colors and normals based on distance and breaking things up using variations and noise textures. And this gives us a little bit more interesting of a surface to work with. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you later.